بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا يا رب العالمين. Before we start, I would like to remind myself and all of us to make dua for our brothers and sisters um, in Gaza, and then there's been a series of strikes, unfortunately, that have taken many of our Muslim brothers and sisters there in the past few days, especially last night. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on them. And of course, to the few deaths that we've had in our community as well. اللهم ارحم موتانا موتى جميع المسلمين الذين شهدوا لك بالوحدانية ولنبيك بالرسالة وماتوا على ذلك. اللهم اغفر لهم وارحمهم وعافهم واعف عنهم وأكرم نزلهم ووسع مدخلهم واغسلهم بالماء والثلج والبرد ونقهم من الذنوب والخطايا كما نقى الثوب الأبيض من الدنس. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We're going to start the lecture today. We are It's the second part of the first lecture that we did, spanning the transmission of Hadith, the history of Hadith compilation and transmission, starting from the time of the Prophet ﷺ and leading all the way up to the major compilations of Hadith that happened in the mid third century. And this is where we stop because this is the most important. We have those books. We have those books right now. We just want, and these are the books that we use. Everything that we have in the Sharia, like the all the sciences, sorry, they lean on these books. They became sources of legislation, historical records, sources of guidance, really. And it is part of the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy on this ummah, the preservation of revelation, the revelation that he sent through his messenger, alayhi salatu wassalam. And because it is something that we rely on heavily, it is very important to know where it's coming from, to have yaqeen or conviction that the Sunnah has been preserved. The Sunnah is a source of legislation because we have a lot of people attacking the prophetic Sunnah, the prophetic tradition from within and from outside of Islam. And you have the people who they call themselves Qur'aniyin, meaning they follow the Quran basically, and they disregard anything that was revealed outside of it. And there are countless proofs of why that's invalid. The lecture that Sayyid Hassan gave much, and he went over many of these proofs. طبعا there's a funny term that people use to talk about these people. They call them Arikiyin, and it comes from the Hadith where the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام says لألفين أحدكم متكئا على أريكته يأتيه الأمر مما أمرت به أو نهيت عنه فيقول لا ندري ما وجدنا في كتاب الله اتبعناه. So Arikiyin comes from Arika. Arika means couch. And the Hadith of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he says, I don't want to see any one of you. I'm paraphrasing a bit, so it may not be verbatim, but the Prophet is saying something along the lines of, no, I don't want to see one of you, lying down in their couch, receiving commands of things that I have commanded or prohibited, and then they say, oh, we don't know, whatever we find in the book of Allah, we follow. So these kinds of people, they have been, the Prophet ﷺ himself warned us from them. The hadith is authentically transmitted. And of course, you have people attacking Islam from outside, Orientalists, who have written extensive pieces of literature, basically attacking the Sunnah, like Noshacht and Goldzahir, and if anyone who has some interest, I guess, in these in this field will know and recognize these names. Or any people who go in da'wah, sometimes you have people trying to surprise you with some very random accusations against the scholars of Hadith and Bukhari himself, and even the narrations of the companions and the Tabi'in. So it's very important for us to know where this is coming from, basically. I'd like to start my any lecture or any. I'd like to try. Yeah, I'd like to start any lecture or any halaqa with a quote, something that I enjoy. I love reading the quotes and getting inspiration from from the Salaf and from maybe even more recent scholars. This quote we have is by Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam. For those who don't know Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam, the student of Imam Ahmad, he described him as Jabal nufakha fihi ruh. He's like a mountain that Allah breathed life into. And Ishaq bin Rahoya, he says, Abu Ubaid is more knowledgeable than Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad. So he's a giant. He's someone who is very, very, very big deal. He wrote a book called غريب الحديث. يعني since we're talking about the topic of hadith, he actually has a book. Is a very famous book, like multi-volume compilation on basically explaining the difficult غريب الحديث, like the difficult words in hadith narrations. So he's a very good scholar. It is said that Imam Shafi'i, for those who know, he never lost in a debate, except that one time it was said that him and Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam were debating a certain matter, and each one of them walked in with an opinion, and by the end of the discussion, each person adopted the other person's opinion. So they kind of flipped opinion. They convinced each other basically. And just to give you an idea of because like you read the statement and you think, yeah, this guy missed a lot, but no, he's a giant. So basically, Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam, he said, Ibn Idris here heard me expressing regret over missing out on studying with certain scholars. So he said, Ya Aba Ubaid, مهما فاتك من العلم فلا يفوتنك العمل. Whatever knowledge passes you by, do not let action pass you by. Of course, as individuals who are interested in seeking knowledge, seeking Islamic knowledge for the sake of lifting ignorance from ourselves, and for the sake of lifting ignorance from those who come around us, يعني it's sometimes we get, I guess, too hung up on the process of acquiring the knowledge, and يعني we sometimes forget what really matters, or what the most important thing, and that is applying that which we have learned. As البيري says يعني وإن أوتيت فيه طول باع وقال الناس إنك قد سبقت فلا تأمن سؤال الله عنه بتوبيخ علمت فهل عملت. يعني فرأس العلم تقوى الله حقا، وليس بأن يقال لقد سبقت وضع في ثوبك الإحسان لا أن ترى ثوب الإساءة قد لبست إذا ما لم يشدك العلم شيئا فخير منه أن لو قد جهلت ولو ألقاك فهمك فيما هاون فليتك ثم ليتك ما فهمت. يعني the gist of the story. البيري طبعا, this is a very famous poem that they teach, or they get the يعني young students of knowledge to memorize, because it really is a nice motivator uh, for someone who is starting their journey in the pursuit of knowledge. And it's also a nice way to remind us of why we do so. So he's telling his student, Abu Bakr, يعني when أوتيت فيه طول باع, like when you have acquire a lot of knowledge and people are like, basically amazed by يعني the high level you've reached, then don't remember, or so don't feel safe. فلا تأمن سؤال الله عنه بتوبيخ علمت فهل عملت. Like remember that Allah will ask you, you've learned, but have you applied? علمت فهل عملت. So that's something that I think and we should all remind ourselves of constantly. This is from Tariq Baghdad, this narration. Anyways, let's get into the topic. So last time we stopped, so we're going to review a little bit where we stopped. But basically, we got all the way up to the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So today, I will say there will be more. And last time I remember some of the names we really focused more on the companions, and even still, maybe some of the names we're not very familiar with all of us. I will say as we move further down from the companions, the names might become even more and more, even less and less familiar. And therefore, I don't want to confuse you guys. I wanted to focus on the most notable names because I'm really trying to convey the idea. We don't need to know every single hadith critical authority that was out there during that time period, but maybe talking about the most important names. Through that, number one, we gain a appreciation of those specific individuals. We add a few more individuals to our dictionary, I guess, of notable Islamic figures, learning a bit from their amazing biographies, and also, and we understand how any of the stages that this process has gone through. Because yeah, again, like you don't really need all the names unless you are like specifically interested in the sciences of hadith, and this is meant to be an introduction. So we're going to talk about Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj and Yahya ibn Ma'in. They lived in two different time periods. I'm going to introduce them when the time comes, just because I just want to go over what we're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about Bukhari, Imam al-Bukhari himself, and his Sahih, and then we're going to talk about some of the critiques that were addressed to the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari and the responses to those critiques. And this will be recorded, so I don't know if you guys are taking notes, or يعني, if there's like, if I'm going too fast, let me know. If you need any clarification, let me know. But generally, if you miss anything, again, I can repeat it, but inshallah, you also have access to the recording. So like I would say focus more, I guess, right now on the concepts. Maybe the names, if you review this, they'll become easier for you to remember. Like, so review. I don't know how many people do we have? Nine? Okay, not bad. Well, I guess eight because I'm number nine. Um, let's see if actually while learning this, I think we went over this. Anyone wanna see like learning this? We said it's a gateway to the Islamic sciences. We said that it helps us uh, strengthen our conviction. Also helps us dispel any misconceptions about the sciences of Hadith or Hadith itself. Preserve the Sharia basically. Um, yeah, I don't want to like go over it again. You have the recording from last time, and let's go to the next question. How many companions? Sorry, did the companions write down hadith? Again, I'll answer this one because it's easy. We said that yes, the companions. There were some narrations that the companions, some of them did write hadith. It just wasn't very common because back then oral transmission was the dominant way to transmit anything, whether it be poetry, whether it be hadith. Even the Quran was more orally transmitted at that point in time. Uh, mhm. Yep. Um, so I'm just reading the comments. Yeah, and what was I saying? Yeah. So they did write down hadith. We have any narrations that Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As wrote hadith. Ali bin Abi Talib had some hadith written. We mentioned that Mustafa al-A'zami. I think I mentioned last time that he was Pakistani. He was Indian. He's not Pakistani. I do apologize for that. That was a slip of the tongue. He was an Indian scholar. I remember the scholar we said studied in Deoband and then he studied in Cambridge, Azhar, and then he studied in Cambridge, and then he became a professor in Saudi. So he's been around. His dissertation, his PhD dissertation, has a list of companions that wrote down hadith, and there were many of them. Uh, Maybe this one I'll quiz you guys. Who are the companions who narrated over 1,000 hadith? We said there were seven of them. Does anyone remember? You don't have to give them in order. If you can, that would be nice. But quickly, like, can we go over some of the names? Yeah, go ahead, sister.
We have Abu Huraira, we have
Yep.
Aisha radiallahu anha, we
Mm-hmm.
have Abdullah bin Abbas,
Mm-hmm.
Anas bin Malik.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Ibn Mas'ud is not on there. He's on the top like eight or something, but he's not top
Yeah.
seven.
Yep. Yeah. He barely. Yeah. He didn't. Honorable
Um,
mention.
Honorable mention, but I think the others can help me out.
Yeah. Anyone else? Remember, guys, the companion we struggled last time, and I gave you a bit of his biography, the story of the camel, or yeah, his camel. No. طيب خلاص. Jabir bin Abdullah. So the companion who narrated the most was Abu Huraira, and then it was Ibn Umar, and then and Abu Huraira is like he's number one by a landslide. He narrated about double the hadith of the second most narration, which was Ibn Umar, sorry. And then it was Anas bin Malik, and then it was Aisha radiallahu anha, and then it was Abdullah bin Abbas, and then it was Jabir bin Abdullah, and then the last one was Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhum. We said five of them stayed in Medina. We said that Anas bin Malik went to Basra, Ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa. Ibn Mas'ud again was not from the seven, he was maybe eighth or ninth. And therefore we said actually maybe I should stop because the next question is I guess I kind of mentioned it, but the main series of hadith transmission we said were Medina. Number one was Medina because a lot of the companions stayed there naturally. And then you also had Basra and Kufa. Who was the most notable companion in Kufa? And who was the most yeah, who was the most notable companion in Kufa for the Hanafis? Yes, sister.
It was it's one of the Abdullahs. Is it either it's Ibn Abbas or Ibn Mas'ud? واحد منهم or
واحد
both.
منهم.
Ibn Mas'ud
Uh,
صح? Yeah.
Ibn Mas'ud, yes, yes. Ibn Abbas was the scholar of Mecca. Ibn
عفوا.
Abbas was a scholar of Quran and Hadith and Fiqh in Mecca. He's the biggest scholar in Mecca. Ibn Mas'ud was the scholar of Kufa. And who's the scholar of Basra? I see the chat. Yes, sir.
Was it Abu Huraira? No, or am I off?
Basra?
لا
No, no,
لا
no,
لا.
no. Abu Hurairah stayed in Medina. Let's see. Ibn Mas'ud. No, Ibn Mas'ud is in Kufa. Basra. We're talking about Basra. He was the last one to die. He was the last one who died.
أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه.
Yeah, yeah. Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu. Actually, I just realized he's in the bottom. Yeah. No, Medina, mashallah, they had options. They had Abu Huraira, they had Ibn Umar, they had Aisha, of course. Radiallahu anhum. May Allah be pleased with all of them. What was that? You asked a question. When the women at the time asked for dedicated class time for them, was there a theme to what the Prophet ﷺ would teach them? To be honest, I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know. I apologize. The question was, and was there a theme for? I'm only saying this because it won't show up in the recording. But the question was asked as, was there a theme for the lessons that the Prophet ﷺ would teach the women? I don't know. Uh, yeah, I apologize. How many? Yeah, actually, this is it's maybe a trivia question, but how many women companions narrated hadith? I think last time I made a mistake. I said how many women companions were there? Like, no, there's more than the number here. It's just that the ones who narrated, how many were they? Yes, sister.
Was it 129?
Yeah, mashallah. It was good. Good memory. Or good notes. Either way, mashallah, good job. Yeah, 129 companions, women companions narrated hadith, and we said that this is the largest number in all the different generations. And does anyone remember why that was the case? Like, why was there more women companions narrating than any other generations? Okay, so
So
basically,
what's the question?
oh yeah, I didn't phrase it properly. So in the generation of the companions, that was where you had the most women narrating hadith. After that, you had fewer and fewer women narrate. You had fewer and fewer women in the chains of hadith. Like fewer women narrated hadith after that generation. So the question is, why is that the case? I'll just answer. So basically, you mentioned how in this generation you had obviously the mothers of the believers and يعني, and then many of the women companions who were friends with them and like and who met the Prophet ﷺ and who would attend his classes and even sometimes the khutbah, like the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ would narrate Surah Qaf in khutbah al-Jum'ah. This was narrated by women. So he had many women, يعني, I guess, also interacting with the Prophet ﷺ narrating his hadith. And these women, remember we mentioned how Abu Huraira would, يعني he was very keen on transmitting hadith, on narrating hadith, to the point where he would even get on the minbar and start narrating hadith to the companions as they waited for the khatib to come to give the Jum'ah khutbah. So the women at that time, most of the people they would narrate to would be their household members, like Aisha radiallahu anha, she would narrate to her nephews, for example. So you had the men in the families of those women companions, they took their knowledge and then they started to spread it afterwards. And of course, after that, you had the typical like masjid halaqas or classes, where the muhaddith would sit, like kind of like Imam Malik. They would sit in the masjid and people would listen to them. Uh, so that's how the hadith of the women companions, that's how they made it, I guess, all the way to us, basically. Uh, let's see, who were some of the hadith authorities from the companions? Is this question clear? Some of the hadith authorities, we mentioned how some of the companions would basically be the critical authorities, making sure that any mistakes that a companion makes when narrating hadith, they correct it. So it's not like any companion would say anything, and because we mentioned that the companions, they're trustworthy, and we know that they're trustworthy. That doesn't mean that anything they say we just take, because where they're trustworthy when it comes to their honesty, they will never lie about the Prophet ﷺ, but they are still human beings. They are prone to making mistakes. You guys remember any of the companions who used to act as critical authorities? Yes, sister.
I know definitely Aisha radiallahu anha was definitely one of the top authorities. But
Yeah.
then again, she would also reference, if she had like someone asked her like a question she didn't know, she would reference other people that were more knowledgeable about matters. So for example, if the feet and like wiping over, she referenced Ali radiallahu anhu, go to him, he would know better. So would he also be one? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. That is correct. Yeah. Aisha radiallahu anha, we mentioned last time how Aisha, mashallah, she was very obviously she's the mother of the believers and she's very, very well respected, and she is and the most notable women scholar in the history of this ummah, and she's definitely one of the top scholars of the companions. And Aisha was not scared of anyone. Remember how we said that there are a lot of claims that hadith developed kind of or was influenced by politics. And we said that that was not true even from the time of the companions. Aisha radiallahu anha would correct the Khalifa himself. She would correct Umar ibn Khattab when if Umar made a mistaken hadith, and she would obviously say, I know he's not a liar, he's truthful, but perhaps he made a mistake. So Aisha radiallahu anha was definitely one of them. Umar ibn Khattab himself was one of the, was very critical. I remember we said Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, he would say that, any hadith in the time of Umar al-Khattab, take it because Umar al-Khattab كان يخيف الناس في الله. Like he would scare people for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was very, very critical. Of course, Umar is a very, I don't know, what's the word? Like authoritative? No, like he's a very strong figure. I don't think anyone would even dare uh, to lie, or like people would be very cautious around him. Same thing with Aisha radiallahu anha. Ibn Umar also was a critical authority. He would correct. And by the way, so Umar died early on, obviously, he was the second Khalifa. And then Aisha radiallahu anha, she died in the year 57, same year as Abu Hurairah, if I'm not mistaken. And then you had Ibn Umar who died 74. So you had obviously Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas and Ibn Mas'ud and Anas bin Malik. They were very young when the Prophet ﷺ died, so they lived longer lives. And then obviously Anas bin Malik also was one of them. Uh, yeah, and then Aisha's main students. I don't want to spend. Let's just review. You can just watch the previous lecture. But Aisha, her main students were obviously her nephews, Qasim bin Muhammad bin Abi Bakr, Urwa bin Zubair, Amr bin Abd al-Rahman. So she was a narrator from the Tabi'een generation. We said there's fewer the Tabi'een women narrators, but she was one of them. Abu Hurairah obviously was Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, uh, and he was, according to Imam Ahmad, the best Tabi'i. Definitely the best Tabi'i in Medina. Other cities, had obviously other tabi'in that were highly praised. Ibn Umar, the most notable were Salim. I made a mistake last time. I think I said Salim bin Umar. That was again a slip of the tongue. It's Salim bin Abdullah bin Umar, like the son of Ibn Umar, not the son of Umar. So the son of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, and also Nafi', the freed slave of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. And Anas bin Malik, he had many. One of them was Hamid al-Tawil. One of them was the names escape me, but whatever. You can find them in the list. And I don't want to bother you guys with all these names right now. Again, we said we want to focus on the process. So after the death of the Tabi'een, I kind of mentioned this last time. I can skip this. Qatada bin Di'am. Yeah, how did I forget Qatada? Qatada is again the most notable student of Anas radiallahu anhu. And we mentioned how Ibn Mas'ud, for example, we said that he's the main scholar in Kufa, but he died early. He died 32 after Hijrah, relatively early. So the chains from Kufa from Ibn Mas'ud are a bit longer than, for example, Anas bin Malik. Because Anas bin Malik, he died at the very end. So you have shorter chains between him and the major compilations of hadith that we have right now. I mentioned this as well. Ali ibn al-Madini, the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari, one of the teachers of Imam al-Bukhari. Imam al-Bukhari actually praises him highly. He says, ما استصغرت نفسي أمام أحد قبل غير أو إلا أمام علي ibn al-Madini. Basically, like I did not belittle myself in front of everyone, in front of anyone, sorry, except for Ali ibn al-Madini. So Imam al-Bukhari had immense respect for Ali ibn al-Madini. So Ali ibn al-Madini, he says, I looked and found that the chains of transmission revolve around 6 men. For the people, for Ahl al-Madina, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and from the people of Mecca, you have Amr bin Dinar, and for the people of Basra, you have Qatada bin Di'am al-Sadusi, and Yahya bin Abi Kathir, and for the people of Kufa, you have Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i and Sulaiman bin Mihran, aka al-A'mash. Again, I don't expect you to remember these names right now, but if you look at these names, if you check the narrations in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, you'll find these names in a lot of narrations because these are not obviously the only names that narrated hadith from those cities, but they are the most notable ones and they're the most trustworthy ones. So you'll find that the authors of the 6 books of hadith, they heavily rely on these names. And I showed you guys this. I kind of glossed over it quickly last time, but this is a typical, I guess, map of like you'll find that the top layer here is the companions, and the bottom layer here, this is Bukhari, this is Muslim, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah. I apologize, I know it's in Arabic, but I hope it's legible. So these are basically the 6 books of hadith, and these are the companions. And this is kind of like this is we said Zuhri. Where is Zuhri from? Zuhri is from Medina. So this is the Madani chain of narration. So you have Anas bin Malik, Abu Huraira, and by the way, Anas, we said yes, he went to Medina. Sorry, he went to Basra, but obviously he would still make Umrah, and he obviously originated from Medina. and Zuhri, يعني anyways. فأبو هريرة ابن عمر عائشة ابن عباس. Uh, where is it? Anas bin Malik, we said he died late, so there's no person between him and Zuhri. And then for these ones, we said there's one person basically because they died a bit earlier. And then you have here, I don't want to focus on the names, but let's see if there's any. Sufyan bin Uyayna. Sufyan bin Uyayna was the equivalent of Imam Malik in Mecca. So Imam Malik was the scholar of Medina, the most notable scholar in Medina, and he had obviously he's the founder of the Maliki madhab in Islamic fiqh and Islamic jurisprudence. Sufyan bin Uyayna had a madhab as well, the Meccan madhab, and Sufyan bin Uyayna was the teacher of Imam al-Shafi'i when Imam al-Shafi'i was a kid. And then of course Imam al-Shafi'i after يعني, reaching a certain age, he moved to Medina, and then he became the star student of Imam Malik as well. Uh, I don't want to focus on all these names. Imam Ahmed obviously is right here. He's also the student of many of these. So trying to see, it's kind of a weird way to draw this. But yeah, anyways, is there any other names? خلاص, no, I don't want to focus on the names, but you guys kind of get the idea. Like this is the Medina Madani school of narration. Sorry, Madani map, I guess. This is Kufa. You have Abdullah bin Mas'ud here. You find that because he died early, again, there's two names instead of one. This is Al-A'mash, and then Sufyan al-Thawri. Sufyan al-Thawri and Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj. Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj, inshallah, we'll get to know him better today. He's a very, very important name when it comes to the critical authority of hadith. Sufyan al-Thawri, we find his name coming a lot in يعني Zuhd and Tazkiyah because of his, mashallah, amazing sincerity. And there's a lot of beautiful narrations pertaining to his, or like from his biography that we learn from. He was also, again, Sufyan al-Thawri, by the way, he was in Kufa. He also had a madhab. Sufyan al-Thawri had a madhab in fiqh, and it was followed, I think, until the 7th Hijri century. So, and he was a faqih, he was a muhaddith. There's narrations of him as well in tafsir. Sorry, so he's a polymath. And these names are also very important. Abdul Rahman bin Mahdi and Yahya al-Qattan and Abdullah ibn Mubarak. Abdullah ibn Mubarak, this name specifically, I highly, highly, highly encourage you guys to read his biography. Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak is someone who was, mashallah, he was very rich. Allah has granted him wealth, and he spent that wealth, basically, he spent it on the students of knowledge. So he was someone who loved the Sunnah. Remember in the first lecture, I said in the beginning, Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, there's a narration where they told him, don't you get bored just staying at home? And he said, how can I get bored or how can I get lonely when I'm in the company of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions? So he had that immense love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. And of course, he spent his wealth for the sake of spreading knowledge. And of course, and there's again, and it's by the way, the books of biographies of these people, wallahi, they're among the best resources to, if someone is working on their tazkiyah, it's really, honestly, it's both serves as an entertainment and also it's a huge, amazing source of tazkiyah. Waki' ibn al-Jarrah, you know the famous poem that Imam al-Shafi'i, he said, شكوت إلى وكيع سوء حفظي. I complained about like my memorization to Waki' and فأرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي. That's the teacher of Imam al-Shafi'i. So he's also a student of Sufyan al-Thawri. I hope I'm not overwhelming you with names. Let me know if I am. I just find that learning about these people, that makes reading the narration chains of narration a lot more fun. Abu Bakr bin Abi Shayba, by the way, he also has a very, very big compilation of hadith. It's in 25 volumes. طيب, so this is the Kufi or Kufi chain of narration. This is the chain of narration in Basra, the most famous one. Again, I emphasize this is not the only one, but this is the most famous one. And like this is how the ahadith from these cities, this is how they made their way into the compilations of hadith that we currently use, from the companion all the way to the major compilations of hadith. So as you can see here, by the way, Basra and Kufa were both in Iraq. So you'll find that the people who were in Kufa, they would travel to Basra and back. So you'll find like Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj is present in both. Shu'ba is here and Shu'ba is here. Let's see. Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, obviously these are the students of Shu'ba. So anything that Shu'ba learned, he could also teach to his students. طيب. I think I mentioned this last time. So the transition to writing, we said that oral transmission was the predominant mode of transmission of hadith in the first uh, يعني 1.5 centuries, I would say. Again, because the Arabs initially they were ummiyin, they were unlettered, or they did not know how to read and write, illiterate. I don't like that word. Maybe I think unlettered is better because they were actually very advanced, I guess, in Arabic and in poetry. They just didn't know how to read and write. Uh, but then I think I mentioned this, but I think it's the next slide. These are like basically the books that, and as you can see here, books began to pop up in the mid second century. So you have Abu Hanifa obviously writing his books. Sufyan al-Thawri, we mentioned, also had a madhab. Al-Layth bin Sa'ad, by the way, is another huge scholar, and he had a madhab in Egypt. And Shafi'i, Imam al-Shafi'i, he said, يعني Al-Layth أفقه من Malik. He's more knowledgeable than Malik, but his students, unfortunately, his students were not the level of Imam Malik's students, and they did not preserve his knowledge as well as Imam Malik's students did. And obviously, this doesn't take anything away from Imam Malik. It just speaks to how amazing Al-Layth bin Sa'ad was. I'm trying to emphasize, I think I mentioned Al-Layth bin Sa'ad, I mentioned Al-Thawri, I mentioned in the beginning, I mentioned Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam, just to show us that for people who think that, oh, I follow for madhahib, like the process of the development of hadith, the development of fiqh was very dynamic. And what we have now is the culmination of the efforts of all these amazing scholars. It's not, and yes, maybe because of our lack of knowledge, sometimes we don't have the tool, I guess, to question or to understand where where this information came from. But it brings me great comfort knowing, I guess, يعني, how involved this process of the process was that helped us reach where we are right now. Anyways, Ibn Ishaq, obviously, the book of Sirah, the famous book of the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, that was also written in that time period. That's it. Yeah, we mentioned here. Actually, I skipped this last time, but you know what? I'll skip it again, just for the interest of time. Feel free to pause and read this on your own time, just for the interest of time. Like, why compile? Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, we said Imam Ibn Hajar. Um, He was, and he is the most famous commentator on Sahih al-Bukhari. He lived in Egypt. He lived and died in Egypt in the ninth, mid eighth, late 8th century until the mid 9th century. And he cited three main reasons of why hadith compilation began. And number one was widespread literacy. Now people can read and write. Number two, scholars are now spreading to different cities. And number three, innovations started to develop at a very quick rate, and that's because of the interaction of the Muslims with يعني, countries that are either newly Muslim or even non-Muslim countries that they now share borders with. So all these different uh, not secular, but non-Islamic sciences, I guess, started to make their way into the Muslim empire. They started to interact with people who don't have a firm foundation, I guess, started to affect their understanding. So obviously you had a lot of innovations developing at that time. So books were a quick or an efficient way, I guess, to spread refutations. And this is why the treaties of Aqidah, you'll find that they begin to starting. By the way, Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote the first treaty in Aqidah, Kitab al-Iman by Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam. It's either the very first one or one of the first. So in the early third century, he had a lot of treaties of Aqidah. Of course, he had the Mu'tazila at that time, challenging the يعني يعني all the bid'ah that and the innovations that they introduced and Mihna of Imam Ahmad. I don't want to focus on that right now. It's a bit beyond the scope of this lecture, but that was one of the main reasons why people began to compile. Number two, we said paper manufacturing entered the Muslims in the early second century. I mentioned how Samarkand, by the way, is in Uzbekistan today. Same as Bukhara, where Imam Bukhari is from. So the Muslims reached Uzbekistan, or the region that is now known as Uzbekistan. That's when they were first introduced to paper. And Samarkand was the first Muslim city, to manufacture paper and slowly started to make its way into the Muslim empire. So paper, remember in the time of companions, people would write on whatever they can get their hands on. And paper wasn't as ubiquitous. It was difficult. Alhamdulillah, nowadays we have iPad, we don't even need paper anymore. Or I guess tablets in general. Anyone is an Android user. Um, yeah, it just became very ubiquitous. طيب. Okay, this is where we stopped last time. Now, I can't believe we spent like 30 minutes. But alhamdulillah, hopefully this was good. Imam Malik, I wanted to, maybe I'll be a bit brief when it comes to Muwatta. Even the Muwatta is one of the greatest books written. Uh, يعني it was the first organized book in Hadith to reach us. And يعني the Muwatta of Imam Malik, there are countless works written on Imam Malik's Muwatta, either about يعني the different branches, but basically يعني mostly commentaries. You have so many commentaries on the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and rightfully so, because it was written by or compiled by Imam Malik, the man who combined, I guess, the knowledge of, or the man who يعني the knowledge of Medina found its way to him. So Imam Dar al-Hijra, that was his nickname, I guess. He compiled the Muwatta, which is a book of hadith for those who don't know. And I said, okay, so it has about 600 ahadith that were directly linked to the Prophet ﷺ. So he has ahadith that are marfu'a. So a hadith marfu' is a hadith that is connected to the Prophet ﷺ. A hadith mawquf is a hadith that is, يعني the chain stops at the, or as a hadith that is attributed, as an athar. Let's say the word athar. Athar, by the way, encompasses the sayings of the Prophet and the Salaf. So it's an athar that is attributed to the companion, not to the Prophet, but to the companion. And you had a hadith maqtu' or athar maqtu', which is or hadith maqtu', which is an athar that um, is attributed to the tabi'i. Okay. So if Al-Hasan al-Basri says something, Al-Hasan al-Basri is a tabi'i. If he says something, it's called a hadith maqtu'. And if Ibn Umar says something, it's hadith mawquf. And of course, if the Prophet says something, it's hadith marfu'. I hope that makes sense. Because in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, he had all three kinds, and he had balaghat and other things. And I don't want to delve too much into that, but I just wanted to mention that not every single hadith in the Muwatta of Imam Malik is directly is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He also compiled a lot of the sayings of the companions and a lot of the sayings of the tabi'in. And because his purpose of writing al-Muwatta was not really just to compile the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, but it is rather to give people the knowledge they need, I guess, to gain an understanding of the fiqh of the Sharia. And it's a book of, it's a compilation that serves a fiqhi benefit, a fiqhi purpose. Um, so yeah, there's about 600 hadith in the Muwatta of Imam Malik that are attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and there's about 1942 total. And this is basically, by the way, I said varies because the Muwatta of Imam Malik, mashallah, was narrated by over 80 individuals. It was narrated by a lot of people, including, and the most famous one is Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, who is Andalusian. You had, I'm going to mention some of the most popular ones. You had Shafi'i, by the way, he narrated the Muwatta, even though unfortunately we don't have his narration in its entirety, but the Shafi'i narrated the Muwatta of Imam Malik. You have Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, and that one's important because Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, who is Muhammad al-Hasan? I feel like I'm rambling. Maybe if you guys, anyone know who Muhammad ibn al-Hasan is? No one? Hanafis? No? Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the companion of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa, he had his two most prominent companions were Qadi Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. How do you guys not know this? No, I'm talking about the Hanafis specifically. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, so Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, he's one of the famous narrators of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And this shows you the respect. Yani Muhammad ibn Hassan, by the way, he learned from Imam Malik, and he was also one of the teachers of Imam al-Shafi'i. So Imam al-Shafi'i studied, and by the way, Imam al-Shafi'i, if you read his book there's a lot of debates like between him and Muhammad ibn Hassan. Like obviously friendly, sincere debates on certain matters between him and Muhammad ibn Hassan. And I remember like I read like one of the scholars, he said, yeah, like you really like this is where you taste the sweetness of knowledge when you read the debates between Imam Shafi'i and Muhammad ibn Hassan, because it was such a high level of understanding and obviously a lot of respect between the two. Anyways, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, his narration of Al-Muwatta, we have it, and it's printed, and the Hanafis love that one. They use it. They have commentaries on it. Um, Abdullah bin Muslim al-Qanabi has Yahya ibn Ma'in there's so many. I don't want to like start mentioning names, but I mentioned this because Al-Muwatta, يعني Imam Malik, he compiled it over 40 years, and there's variations between the different narrations. So some like they have different numbers of ahadith. Imam Malik would sometimes add, sometimes remove. Obviously, some of them would make mistakes. And we have a lot of these narrations, so you'll find some variation. Like the most famous one is Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, and this is the one. If anyone knows Sheikh Sa'id al-Kamali, he actually, and he teaches that. He has weekly Muwatta uh, lectures where he teaches and Muwatta basically. And he uses that one. That one is very famous among the scholars of Andalus and Maghrib, like Northern Africa, because again, Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi was Andalusian. Um, Trying to think of what else I want to mention. And yeah, you obviously have like Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri. His narration, it said 1942. That one, Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri has about 3,000 narrations. So there's a lot of variation between them. Uh, what else did I say? Imam al-Shafi'i, he says, there is not on the face of this earth after the book of Allah, a book more authentic than the book of Malik. Of course, he made this statement. Imam al-Shafi'i died in the year 204. So when Imam al-Shafi'i died, none of the major compilations of hadith were written. But of course, this statement holds a lot of truth because among the hadith that Imam Malik narrated, especially the ones that are directly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, almost all of them are, we deem to be authentic. Some of them are contested. There is no fabricated hadith. Some of them, some scholars might deem them to be a bit weak, and that just has to do with the difference of opinion. Imam Malik has had his opinion. So Imam Malik was very picky about choosing who to narrate from, to the point where someone asked him once, is this person trustworthy? He asked him about a man in Medina, and he asked him, is this narrator trustworthy? And Imam Malik said, do you find him in my books? If he is not in my books, then he's not trustworthy. So he's very picky when it came to picking who he narrates from. So any hadith that people deem to be weak, it's a difference of opinion between Imam Malik and that person when it comes to this specific narrator. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, by the way, he was the man who built, he was the Khalifa who built Baghdad. The city of Baghdad was built by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur 12 years before his death. So 146. So Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, he loved Imam Malik. He loved knowledge and he loved Imam Malik. And he told Imam Malik, and let's mandate al-Muwatta, let's make that the official book for all the cities. Imam Malik, of course, he's a scholar and he's very wise. And he told him, don't do that because the companions of the Prophet ﷺ spread to all these different cities. And you guys know the companions have different opinions when it comes to certain things. So these cities, the Islamic knowledge developed in them, and there's now some, quite a few differences. We see this, and we see this in the difference between like the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Hanbalis and the madhab that we have. And as Imam Malik says, these differences are mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not a problem. It becomes a problem when you try to force the entire ummah to adopt one certain opinion, especially after they had generations working upon or acting upon an opinion that is different. Another opinion that is different that also has I don't know, a big companion basically behind. So Imam Malik refused to make that the official book, I guess, of the Ummah. Alhamdulillah, it's good for us. It speaks to his wisdom. Next. Yeah, we mentioned that al-Muwatta of Imam Malik was narrated by a lot of students. The most famous is Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Remember I mentioned the elephant story? Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi came all the way from Andalus, and it's funny. An elephant came to Medina, and obviously, right now, you just go to the zoo to see it. Actually, I don't know if they have elephants in the zoo. I haven't been to the zoo since I was a kid, but you can even see it on YouTube. Basically, to us, like we all know what an elephant looks like, but to these people, there's no television. Like they actually like. You hear of like there's a creature called an elephant, you don't even know what it looks like. So, to have an elephant come all the way to Medina was a big occasion. So everyone went to see the elephant. So Imam Malik came to the masjid, and the only person there was Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. And he told him, like, I don't think you guys have elephants in Andalus. Aren't you interested in seeing the elephant? And he said, I came to Medina not to see the elephant, but to see Malik ibn Anas. It's a very nice story, alhamdulillah. Can I take me to the zoo? I don't know, man. I actually like. I don't like the zoo, man. Like just looking at the animals in the cages, it hurts. Um, I don't know. Yeah, inshallah. Yeah, Imam Malik, he actually, so a lot of the narrations, Imam Malik, he wouldn't actually narrate the hadith and people would hear them, but vice versa. Like he would get people would read the Muwatta of Imam Malik to him and he would approve it. And then Imam Malik said, yani whoever said they won't be satisfied except by hearing, like by hearing him recite, then he told him, like, how is it sufficient? Or how is it not sufficient for you in hadith, but you find it sufficient in Quran? You know, like when we do an ijazah in Quran, the student recites to the teacher and the teacher approves of the recitation of the student. So Imam Malik is saying the same logic should follow for hadith. That was his opinion. Um, I think I mentioned this. Yeah, I mentioned this there from just about anyone. Yeah, Ali ibn al-Madini. Remember how he said the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari? Any Madani whom Malik did not narrate from, then there must be something wrong with their narration. So Imam Malik was the top critical authority in Medina. And Imam Malik, obviously, and if you study the usul of the Maliki madhab, uh, you'll find that Imam Malik sometimes would narrate a hadith, but he would not act upon it because he would say, I have not seen a single person from the people of Medina act upon this hadith. Imam Malik's usul, they placed high emphasis on the amal ahl al-Medina, like the actions of the people of Medina. Anything that the people of Medina don't do, they will not do. Um, and Yahya bin Ma'in, this is the second name that we'll focus on today. He was asked about Imam Malik's lack of narration, and he said it's due to his selectiveness. He was very selective in what to narrate. So he knew a lot more ahadith than what he put in the Muwatta, but he's very selective. And by the way, the word Muwatta, like from tawti'ah, like to bring something close. So it's meant as a like the purpose of the book is to make understanding of religion easier for us and to be made easy for whoever studies it. And that's another reason why Imam Malik was so selective. And Ibn Abdul Barr, by the way, Ibn Abdul Barr, does anyone know who Ibn Abdul Barr is? I feel like if you guys don't know, I could just give me an indication. Maybe I should tone it down a bit. Imam Ibn Abdul Barr, Yusuf bin Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Abdul Barr, he is, they call him Hafiz al-Maghrib. So we had Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi was called Hafiz al-Mashriq and Ibn Abdul Barr was called Hafiz al-Maghrib, the Hafiz of Maghrib, because they both died in the same year, by the way, 463. So Ibn Abdul Barr, he wrote the most famous compilation, the most famous commentary on Al-Muwatta. He actually has two commentaries, التمهيد لما في الموطأ من المعاني والأسانيد, and he had الاستذكار. So these two books, especially التمهيد. التمهيد is, I believe it was Imam al-Zahabi, one of the Imams, he said, it's one of the greatest books written in the history of this ummah. It's an amazing book. And the reason why he has two commentaries is because one of them focuses on the hadith aspects of Muwatta and the other one focuses on the fiqh aspect of Muwatta. And they even have different ordering. Like al-Istidhkar is ordered the same way Imam Malik ordered the al-Muwatta. Al-Tamheed, he orders it based on the narrations. Based on the narrators. So the ordering of the hadith is different because he focuses on the hadith. Anyways, so Imam Ibn Abdul Barr, he says, whoever confines himself to the hadith of Malik has spared himself the toil of searching and investigation and has laid his hand upon a firm and unbreakable handle. For Malik critically examined, selected, and purified, and he narrated only from transmitters who were trustworthy and authoritative. So, the motto of Imam Malik is a treasure. May Allah have mercy on Imam Malik. And by the way, sometimes I've heard some people say, how come we don't, I guess, quote Hadith Muwatta as much as we quote from the other books of Hadith? And there's many answers to this. The most, I guess, relevant one is the fact that most of the Hadith in Muwatta that are authentic, you'll find them in the major compilations of Hadith. So Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, they didn't meet Malik, obviously. They were born after he died, but they did meet his students. And from his students, they narrated most of the authentic hadith that are in the Muwatta. So you'll find them in the Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. But even still, Muwatta is still studied. It's usually the book that people start studying when you want to go through the books of hadith. I'm studying right now with a teacher. Of course, anyone who's familiar with Arabic, you'll find that the commentary of Sheikh Sa'id al-Kamili is not only is it beneficial, but it's also a lot of fun. And it will make you want to become Maliki, even if you're not. I'm not saying you should switch madhab, I'm just saying it's, mashallah, is very beautiful. Uh, Scholars would often not let their students fix their books during class. This also has to go with the goes back to the idea of writing books. So, um, by the way, يعني, to the people who are, يعني, I guess, obsessed with it has to be documented in a book. Like, how else do we verify that it's correct? Like, if you look at the number of typos and mistakes, يعني, there's like, and if you look at the manuscripts, the different manuscripts for the same book, you'll find tons and tons, like countless mistakes. Like it's called تضحيف. It's basically typos. يعني, to the point where sometimes it's better to just rely on the oral narration because it doesn't give any chance, especially with the dots, because sometimes some of these things wouldn't have dots, or like they'll put the wrong dot and would flip the meaning. Or sometimes you have a chain of narration and يعني, for example, trying to عبيدة عبيدة, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of names that one dot will flip the name, and instead of having someone who's trustworthy be someone who's, or you can make someone who's weak appear to be very trustworthy because he flips his name with someone else, basically. So it can cause a lot of problems, like relying on written manuscripts. I don't think that's something I mentioned last time, but that's also, yeah, one thing to keep in mind. I don't think that just because it's written on a book, uh, it's more reliable. Like sometimes the book can be worse than the oral narration. I have this funny story. Al-Masisi, Al-Hajjaj bin Muhammad al-Masisi, he was in the gathering of Abdullah ibn Mubarak, and he was reading Hammad's book. And then he told Abdullah ibn Mubarak, I need to go pee, basically. I need to go to the washroom. And then he went, and then Abdullah ibn Mubarak is like, Wallahi, this guy did not go to the washroom. He went to fix his book because the scholars didn't like, because it breaks the flow. So they didn't like people correcting the next notebook during class. So this guy pretended to go to the washroom just so he could fix the notebook. And then after Imam Malik, obviously Imam Malik, maybe not obviously, but Imam Malik, he didn't travel much. I mean, he was in the fortunate situation that knowledge would come to him. So he's being in Medina and whatnot. And يعني, we mentioned how most of the companions stayed in Medina, so he had access to a vast amount of knowledge. So he didn't have to travel. But after the time of Malik, rahimahullah wa radiya anhu, people started to travel more. So the authors of the compilations of hadith that we use, if you read their biographies, you'll find that they've been all over the place. طيب, Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj is a very important figure because Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, he said يعني هو أول من وسع الكلام في الجرح والتعديل. He was the first to expand upon the topic of jarh, which is criticism, and ta'dil, which is approval of narrators. So remember in the time of the companions, we said all the companions are trustworthy. You don't have to worry about a companion lying. And we mentioned the proofs for that. Making mistakes, that's fine. يعني they made mistakes. They were very few. I remember how Abu Huraira, I forgot the number. Was it 8 or 11? يعني Aisha radiallahu anha, she corrected Abu Huraira in about 0.2% of his narrations. And Abu Huraira, we said, يعني, he was narrating to the entire like congregation in the Nabawi Masjid in front of all the companions. Abu Huraira, uh, يعني his ahadith, as we say in Arabic, جاوزت القنطرة. Like it was peer reviewed by all the companions in Medina, and they only found mistakes with like 0.2% of it. So when it comes to mistakes in memorization, there were very few. And when it comes obviously with trustworthiness and honesty, all of them were honest. But as time progressed, you started to have people who are motivated by things other than religion, unfortunately. You had people start lying. You had people, and by the way, not everyone who lied, and some people had good intention. They had well-intentioned lies, but of course, we do not accept that. Uh, so it became very important to, uh, first of all, make sure that the narrators are all honest, and number two, it became more difficult to narrate because, as you know, like I don't know, it's called broken Skype, I think. You know that game, broken Skype, when you say something and that person has to whisper to the next person, next person, next person. 3, 4 people down the line, you get a completely different message. And that just has to do with the, I don't know, like mistakes that people make in memorization. Yani with each name, sorry, that you add, it becomes more difficult to transmit a message. And this holds true for hadith, of course. This is why we don't take from just about anyone. We look for people who are trustworthy in the sense that they have very strong memories and it's been documented that they have accurate uh, transmissions, basically, or sorry, accurate narrations. And how do we know this? Uh, we look at the hadith of Abu Huraira, for example, and then we look at like maybe 5 or 10 of his students, and we look, okay, what did each one of them narrate? And you find that, yani, which ones, like which narrators match the other, basically. You look for matches, basically. Like they all have to match. If one of them deviates, you know that that person made a mistake, basically. So, and that's the kind of the critical process that these critics would go through to make sure if someone is trustworthy or approve of someone or criticize them and say that this person is weak, basically. So Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, his name is Abu Bistam, Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj ibn al-Ward al-Azdi al-Ataki. So he's from Azd, so Yemeni origin. He's from Basra, and he was nicknamed Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith. Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith. I think that later became like a title that people assigned to like the highest level of scholars of Hadith. So Imam Shu'bah, rahimahullah, he died in the year 160, by the way. I mentioned why, like it's very beneficial to know when people died, because then you can know who lived in which guy's time. Like, did this person meet that person? It's very, very important, especially in the science of hadith, because you want to ascertain that this person, like it is possible for this person to narrate from that person. And that was one of the first ways they would catch someone lying, you know? There's narrations, and one of the critics of hadith, he was told that this guy is claiming that he heard this hadith from that person. He told him, which year did you hear this hadith? And he said, this year. And he's like, oh. So you heard this hadith 7 years after the guy died. And at least if someone's lying, it's like, at least get your dates right. So that was the first security check, basically. It's like, if you know when people died, you have an idea that they live in the same time period. Is it possible that this person narrated from that person? Anyways, so Shu'bah, he kind of made this critical process. Before then, it wasn't systematic. It was a bit, scattered. It's just like, it's still developing basically, but he made a nice system. And then he would say things like, تعال نغتب في الله, like let's backbite for the sake of Allah. نذكر عيوب الكذابين, like mentioning the defects of the people of hadith. عفوا, عيوب المحدثين. Or he said, اليوم ليس يوم حديث, اليوم يوم غيبة. تعال نغتب الكذابين. I'm trying to remember the Arabic because I translated it. He said, today is not a day of hadith, today is a day of backbiting. Come, let's backbite the liars. So he would have gatherings where, by the way, when he says backbite, he doesn't mean backbiting in the way that we use it. It's more of a joke, I guess, or lighthearted comment. He means mentioning their defects pertaining to hadith. And there's like, if you read the books of sciences of hadith, this quote unquote backbiting, there's a lot of regulations, let's say, that the scholars of hadith would impose upon themselves because they are very, it's very, very fine line. Imam al-Bukhari, he says, I hope to meet Allah and not get punished for backbiting anyone ever. And Imam al-Bukhari, as we will come to see, uh, he was a top scholar, I guess, in Jarh wa Ta'dil, in the science of men, and in the science of critiquing narrators of hadith. He spoke about thousands of men, basically, grading them. This guy is good, this guy is weak, this guy is this. Yes, sister. Didn't want to say something? No? Okay. Uh, طيب. So, yeah, when I say backbite, طبعا, if I go to the next slide, Hashim bin Bashir, he said we would leave the gatherings of Shu'bah since he would implicate us in backbiting. So this is something that it was new. Right? People were not used to this, but it later became, as I said, and he created a system that was used after him by the major scholars, and it became crucial. This is a crucial turning point in the science of hadith transmission. He was accused of backbiting since he was a pioneer. After his time, again, these accusations died down. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like I'm going relatively fast. Any clarifications, questions?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yeah, I have a question regarding maybe 2 slides before
Ah,
when the scholars we're not allowing the students to fix the.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Like, do you know what's the reason behind that?
It would disrupt the class basically. يعني it's like go fix it on your own time basically.
Oh, okay.
Because the gathering and you'd have maybe hundreds or thousands of students, and if some guy is reading, he's reading يعني انت you'd have one student reading from his notebook to the group. Then to imagine you have like hundreds of people waiting, and it's like, oh wait, let me fix this.
Oh,
And like everyone has to wait. It breaks the flow.
okay.
Yeah.
جزاك الله خير.
Well, yeah, it's also a way of like telling them like when you come here, you better have prepared, yani when you like take good notes. It's a sign of like respecting other people's time as well.
جزاك الله
Yeah,
خير.
yeah, they're very strict. Even sometimes with narrating, the guy was like, I will only narrate this hadith once. If you don't memorize it, yani good luck. That's yani some of the scholars used to do that. Like, any other questions? Yes, just
It seems like they viewed the book as like an asset to the oral tradition, and the oral tradition was like the primary mode of learning, like from chest to chest kind of thing.
mhm. Yeah.
And I feel like I'm not too sure, but I feel like present day, the only place that I know where it's still like that is in Mauritania. Is there any other like place in the world that does that?
Well, I don't know of other places, but yeah, Mauritania, they really, yani, I don't know the percentage of Hafal they have, but the average Muslim there is probably more knowledgeable than some scholars in other countries. Um, by the way, yani, I'm not going to say it changed, but uh, written records became important because again, the chains got very big. Like they grew exponentially because with each generation, yani, you have one scholar, you have one companion, maybe five people narrate from them. And then if 10 people narrate from the companion, now you have 50. And if 10 people narrate, now you have 500. So this is how you get to the point where Imam Ahmed says that he has memorized a million ahadith, a million narrations, obviously. So at that point, they started actually writing stuff down, but the books they would only go back to if they're not sure, or if yani, like that would not be the main resource. Like the main resource was still their memory, but they had written records of yeah, we're definitely not exercising our memory faculties, unfortunately. Also, we have a lot of distractions. Yani, we unfortunately memorize a lot of useless information. Makes it difficult to build a mind palace. Uh, yeah. So Sharba, yeah. Remember last time we said Muhammad bin Sirin from the Tabi'een, the one who said, "Inna hadha al-ilma deen," this knowledge is the religion. So be watchful, be careful of whom you take religion from. Uh, he's kind of so he said yani, he was among the first to yani really pay attention to to who he takes from. So Ibn Sirin, but again, he was a tabi'i. So again, there were not too many names. So even during his time, that knowledge was not really solidified or yani, uh, standardized. And then you had Ayyub al-Sikhtiyani, his student, and then from Ayyub al-Sikhtiyani, that reached Shu'bah. And Shu'bah, mashallah, he went and made a whole science out of this. Is anyone, someone unmuted? They have something to say, or I'll assume if you don't raise your hand that you don't have. But feel free to interrupt me, of course. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, by the way, يعني maybe one of the reasons why he was so I guess critical or يعني very precise. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj was يعني he's heavily invested into poetry in his early days, kind of like Imam Shafi'i. He was very invested in poetry. He'd memorized a lot of poetry, and he would even correct verses of poetry. And as I mentioned here, famous story, Al-Asma'i of Shu'bah correcting Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. Does anyone know who Abu Amr ibn al-Ala is? Maybe some of you might have come across that name. Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. Anyone want to take a guess? Never heard of him. Okay. Have you guys Have you guys heard of the riwayah of As-Susi عن أبي عمرو or الدوري عن أبي عمرو? Anyone know that riwayah? One of the قراءات. Yeah, I led once in it. Yeah. So it's the riwayah is the قراءة of أهل البصرة, of the people of Basra. Their قراءة is the قراءة of Abu Amr ibn al-Ala al-Basri. So Abu Amr ibn al-Ala is one of the narrators of the 10 qira'at. He's also a scholar in Arabic grammar, uh, and he's, I guess, a scholar in poetry as well. So there's a famous story, Al-Asma'i. Al-Asma'i, by the way, again, is a scholar of the Arabic language, and he narrated a lot of poetry. So he said, يعني Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj would correct Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. So Abu Amr ibn al-Ala was reciting poetry. Shu'bah corrected him, and Al-Asma'i said Shu'bah was right. Al-Asma'i was like the judge between them because Shu'bah, that's Al-Asma'i, that this is his specialty. And by the way, Al-Asma'i, we mentioned how his specialty was poetry. Al-Asma'i has a famous narration. He says, صححت شعر هذيل على فتى من قريش يقال له محمد بن إدريس. He said, I basically reviewed the poetry of Hudayl. Hudayl is one of the famous Arab tribes. He said, I reviewed the poetry of Hudayl, or I tested, I guess, my memorization of the poetry of Hudayl with a young boy from Quraysh whose name was Muhammad bin Ismail. Sorry, Muhammad bin Idris. Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i, as I mentioned, was very invested in poetry. I know this is not really relevant here, but these stories, I feel like they help us gain more appreciation for these scholars. طيب. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj. They asked him, when is a man's hadith abandoned? When do you abandon someone's hadith? When do you deem someone to be weak enough that you don't take hadith from them? He said, it's in one of four cases. If he narrated from well-known narrators, what well-known narrators did not know. So, for example, someone claims to have heard a hadith from Aisha, okay? And that hadith they narrate was not narrated by Urwa ibn Zubayr. It was not narrated by Abd al-Rahman bin al-Qasim bin Abi Bakr. Sorry, Qasim bin Muhammad bin Abi Bakr. It was not narrated by Amr bint Abd al-Rahman. Like the top students of Aisha, none of them narrate this hadith. So it's like, where did this person get this hadith from? I mean, there's a narration where, actually, I think we'll get to it. But yeah, if not, it draws suspicion. If you know all the top students that spent maybe a few decades with a scholar of hadith, none of them narrates a hadith, and then someone random comes and he's like, I heard this hadith from this person. That's one case in which Shu'bah says, you know what? I don't know if I should trust this guy. Number two, someone makes a lot of mistakes, and we said, how do you know if someone makes a lot of mistakes? You compare the narration of this person to the narration of every other person who narrates from the same person that this person narrated from, and you see, like, does this narration match the narration of the people whom you know are the most trustworthy when it comes to narrating from the specific hadith narrator? If not, then you know that this person is making a lot of mistakes. Or if someone has been accused of lying, and if people claim this guy's a liar, that's a clear red flag. Maybe you shouldn't be taking hadith from this person. And then last thing he said, if he narrates a hadith that is universally considered incorrect and he refused to correct himself. So sometimes, like, he wouldn't really, because there's a distinction between this and the second. The second, like making a lot of mistakes, maybe the mistakes are not huge, major mistakes. But if a hadith is clearly universally rejected and someone insists that he heard this hadith, then again, Shu'bah is like, okay, I'm not going to narrate from this guy. And he hated tadlis. Does anyone know what tadlis means? The term tadlis. Anyone know what that means? Okay. So tadlis, by the way, there's different kinds of tadlis. The most common one is, let's say, actually, we can use a common day example. So let's say, we go to, I don't know, we're taking anatomy and physiology. Maybe that's not a good example. I don't know why. It just popped in my head. So you're taking that course, and you go every day, and then so whenever you say, "Hey, the professor said X, Y, Z," and then one day you miss the class, so you don't know what the professor said. Your friend tells you what the professor said, but instead of saying, "My friend told me that the professor said," you just say, "The professor said." So you skip your friend. So this would happen as well among the people who narrate hadith. Sometimes they would skip, like, again, maybe they will miss a class, and this is the most common case. Because remember the case of broken Skype, like the more names you have, the less desirable your chain becomes. People would look for the narrations that are as short as possible. So in order to preserve that shortness or that length of that chain, sometimes people would skip a person, especially if they're within their generation. Like this is the lightest form of tadlis. And then you have like very bad tadlis. You have like really bad one. For example, um, someone is narrating a hadith from a narrator that's weak, and you know that person is weak. And if you tell people, I heard this hadith from this person, they will not accept it because he's weak. So what do? You call him by a name that he's not known for. And that way people are like, okay, this is not that person who's weak. So they're more likely to accept your narration. An example of this, for example, you can say, uh, someone would say like, حدثني Abdullah bin Adam. And people are like, who the heck is Abdullah bin Adam? And he says, Abdullah, because everyone, we're all ibadullah, like we're all Abdullah, we're all slaves of Allah, and Adam, because we're all sons of Adam. Or for example, I'll give you an easier example. Like if someone says, حدثني Abu Salih al-Shaybani. Does anyone know who Abu Salih al-Shaybani? You guys all know who he is, but if I say Abu Salih al-Shaybani, do you know who I'm talking about? All of you know him, by the way. Imam Ahmed, his son, his name is Salih, and he's Shaybani. So Imam Ahmed obviously is very trustworthy, but يعني, just to show you an example. So you can really يعني, call someone anything, and yeah, that's a form of tadlis. So Shu'bah hated all kinds of tadlis. يعني, some scholars, they would accept. يعني, if you remember the first category I gave you, if someone is trustworthy, uh, and they just skip, I guess, the friend because they missed, يعني, مثلا it's from the same teacher, you miss hadith one day, you miss the hadith session one day, your friend tells you what was narrated on that day, you just narrate directly from the sheikh. Some scholars accept that. Of course, it adds weakness to the chain. And they don't ignore it, but they might accept it, depending on who the person is. So Shu'bah would refuse any kind of tadlis. And he said, كل حديث ليس فيه أخبرنا وحدثنا, because, he said حدثنا, like حدثنا, like he told us, this person informed us. You can't say حدثنا if you're doing tadlis. You have to say عن, like from. So it's called صيغة موهمة. It's vague. يعني you have to add vagueness, otherwise you'd be a liar. And tadlis is different from lying. Like it's not lying technically. It's just concealment of a certain element of the truth. So he said any hadith that doesn't have حدثنا, like if it's not explicitly stating that this person heard from that person, فهو خل المباح. Like I'm not going to take it. And he has a more extreme statement. He says لأن أزني أحب إلي من أن أدلس. يعني to fornicate, to commit zina is more beloved to me than to commit tadlis. And طبعا Ibn Salah, he said no, like he doesn't mean it. Like this is an exaggeration. But yeah, he really, really hated tadlis. He's very strict. I hope I just used this as an introduction to the concept of tadlis. I hope it was clear. Does anyone have any questions about tadlis? No, I can continue. Right. Shu'bah was very impartial, so he did not let a person's righteousness affect his assessment of his narrations. The famous example is Aban bin Abi Ayyash. Aban bin Abi Ayyash, he was known for his worship. So he was a zahid. He would do a lot of worship. However, he would fabricate hadith. So you cannot rely on him on hadith at all. So Shu'bah would always expose him. Don't take from Aban. Don't take from Aban is a liar. Do not take hadith from Aban. To the point where other major scholars, respected scholars in Basra, they told him, يعني خلاص, lay off the guy. You're hurting his reputation. So he said, okay, fine. Uh, and then I remember like at one time they were in a janaza, like they were burying someone. He said, you know what, this is the matter of religion. I cannot. That which you have asked me, he went to it was Hamad bin Zayd who asked him to stop and lay off of him. He said, I cannot. This is a matter of the deen. I cannot stop. And then in that same gathering, he continued to expose Aban, even though he's a person of worship. But yani, when it comes to transmission of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, there's no mujamal, like no special treatment. He employed several tactics to evaluate narrators. So sometimes he would give the narrator wrong narrations to test them. So he say, did you narrate that this person said narrated from this person, from this person? So he give him a chain. It's like, did you narrate this? And it'll be wrong. Like maybe he would flip a name, or he would remove a name, or he would add a name. And if that person says yes, I did, then that person is either a liar or he has weak memorization. In either case, you will not take from them. You'll say that person is weak. And by the way, it's called talqeen. This method is called talqeen, and it was employed not just by Shaba but by people after him, and it's criticized. There's a funny story in the time of Imam Ahmed and his friend. I'll mention when we get to it. So that's one method. He also tested the narrators of hadith over the years to ensure that their memory is intact. Because a lot of people, like sometimes people question, like, why does this person take, or why do you take this narration here, but you don't take his narration in another place? Or why do you take the narration of narrator A from C, but not the narration of B from C? And a lot of times the reason for that is this person, after reaching a certain age, he grew older, his memory became weak, and he started making lots of mistakes. And when he began making lots of mistakes, you can't take from him anymore. So person A, he caught him when he was young, when his memory was intact. Person B, he caught him, I guess, after he started making a lot of mistakes. So it's very interesting. So by doing this, by testing that person over the years, you can tell, you know when, I guess what the cutoff points. Like after this age, maybe we should not take hadith from him anymore because he started to make mistakes. And then he would compare narrations between different people. I think I mentioned this before. He would look for someone who's contradicting trustworthy narrators. I mentioned that. So Qatada bin Da'am al-Sadusi, he's the most notable student of Anas bin Malik. Remember we said the chain of Basra, it goes through Qatada. So he said Qatada narrates 200 hadith from Anas. So how does Aban know 2,000? Doesn't make sense. Aban, the one who we mentioned, he was exposing him all over the place. And he would look at the difference between trustworthy narrators. So he'd try to look at the best narrator from a certain sheikh. So for example, the scholars do the same thing, by the way, for Zuhri, for example. Zuhri, they would say, okay, like they would compare between مثلا Imam Malik from Medina and Sufyan bin Uyayna from Mecca. And they would compare these two among all the other narrations to figure out who made the fewest mistakes. So even among the trustworthy narrators, they would have a hierarchy. And sometimes the narration will be unique to one person. So that uniqueness, some of it is unforgivable. Like I mentioned, if it's a hadith that there's no way, like a hadith, the content of the hadith is so important and so pertinent that there's no way one person from like out of 100 would narrate this hadith. So if he sees something like that, sometimes he would put an X on the narrator, especially if we don't know this person. Like someone you don't know narrates something that's crucial, and he claims that he heard it from someone famous, and yet none of that famous person's students narrate that hadith. In that case, they will just ignore it, and they will put an X on that person. And then they would look at the narrations in the book. Again, the books were used as a reference. He would look for a person's predisposition to lying. Obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. Date discrepancies, I think I mentioned this. So if someone claims to narrate from someone who died before they were born, or if they were like maybe 3 years old, then yeah, that person's lying. And he would check, because sometimes a common mistake, for example, the hadith of don't write after me, لا تكتبوا عني. Remember I mentioned that hadith last time? The Prophet said, don't write after me, and whoever writes after me anything other than the Quran, let them delete it, or let them erase it. That hadith is mentioned in Sahih Muslim. And I mentioned some of the explanations of this hadith. There's actually something I did not mention because I don't know, I felt like I didn't want to confuse you guys. But Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Abu Dawood and some of the other scholars, they think they said that this hadith is a mistake. This hadith is falsely attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, is actually from the sayings of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri himself, the companion. So the narration in Sahih Muslim, there's a mistake in it. And by the way, we don't claim that every single hadith in Bukhari and Muslim is authentic. But we know that the vast majority of them are. And the very few, whatever like mistake that there is, these went through rigorous, I guess, proof checking processes. And what I just mentioned, that's an opinion of Bukhari and Abu Dawud, not the opinion by everyone. Anyway, that's just an example. So sometimes hadith narrator might make a mistake, and instead of so he would make a statement of the companion, he would link it to the Prophet by mistake. And how would you know this? Again, you look at the same narration. So Abu Huraira narrates a hadith. sorry, not Abu Huraira says something. It's not a hadith. Abu Huraira says something. It's a statement of Abu Huraira. And you'll find that maybe out of 10 of his students, 9 of them, they attribute it to Abu Huraira. One of them attributed it to the Prophet ﷺ. So you know that person made a mistake. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes maybe 9 of them would narrate a hadith and sorry, link a hadith to the Prophet, and one of them would stop at Abu Huraira. So that could be a mistake as well. So you know that it is not mawquf. And we said mawquf hadith is a statement of a companion, and a marfu' is a statement of the Prophet. So he would compare the different narrations to see if there's a discrepancy. And that way he can judge. And whoever made that discrepancy, that's a point taken against them. That's a mistake they made. So they make record of that. And if they make enough of those mistakes, that's when you know someone is weak, because they make a lot of mistakes. A few mistakes are acceptable. There's actually even a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari from Imam Malik, where Imam Malik says, يعني فيوضع في نهر الحياة أو الحياة. Like the slave after being in the hellfire, he's taken out of the hellfire, and he's dipped in the river of Hayat or Hayat with a hamza. And Hayat means life, and Hayat is like modesty. And يعني both of them could technically be true. So the scholar says نهر الحياة أو نهر الحياة شك مالك. Malik doubted himself. So the narrator was so precise. He mentioned that يعني Malik was not sure. And then they went to other narrations, and they know it's نهر الحياة with a ta, يعني the river of life. So they're very precise when it comes. And this is in Bukhari, by the way, this narration that I mentioned. It's in Kitab al-Iman, at the beginning of the book. Uh, yeah, and he would not narrate from certain individuals due to matters of piety or khawarim al-muru'ah. Khawarim al-muru'ah, I don't know of a good translation for it, but it's basically things that, يعني, I don't know, like eating, I think I mentioned, like not covering the thigh. By the way, not covering the thigh is a difference of opinion. Uh, I don't want to get into it, يعني, but, or like someone who talks too much, or someone who uses musical instruments, or someone who plays chess. The playing of chess, by the way, is also context dependent. Like, don't take that statement generally and go with it. But things that might be deemed, like maybe in our day and age, I don't know, like someone who plays video games all day, I don't know, something like that. I mean, reasons why people might like lose respect. Anyone has any better like definition of khalam al-muru'ah? Let me know. But I'm just trying to explain the idea. Let me think. Yeah, but he did not weaken. Okay, so he did not say, like, this is important. He did not say that person was weak. It's just that he chose not to narrate from that person because he was very selective. He doesn't say like this person is not trustworthy. He just chose to look for someone else. He was too strict. He was called a Haruri. Haruri is a sect from the Khawarij. So it's like some people call him a Khariji, basically. Actually, sorry, he would call himself Haruri. Yeah, he would call it's like I'm a Khariji, basically. Again, as a joke. Don't take it literally. He's not a Khariji. Um, he would test his teachers, even the most trustworthy ones. Humayd al-Tawil, for example. Humayd al-Tawil is one of the students of Imam Malik. Sorry, astaghfirullah. Anas bin Malik. He's one of the students of Anas bin Malik, companion. And one time, Humayd al-Tawil, he was narrating a hadith, and Shu'bah asked him, did you hear this hadith from Anas bin Malik himself? And Humayd said, I might have, perhaps. And then Shu'bah, he like did this with his hands, like, I have no need for this hadith. Because again, we said he hates tadlis. He hates it when someone skips a name. So then he left. And then Humayd said, I have heard this hadith from Anas bin Malik multiple times, but because of because Shu'bah was too strict, I wanted to, يعني أردت أن أفسد يعني I wanted to ruin the narration for him, basically. And he just to punish him. By the way, like, he's not withholding knowledge. I think we still have that narration. He just didn't give it to Shu'bah. He was very objective, Shu'bah, rahimahullah. His method was, again, we mentioned, targeted mainly non-religious metrics. So he even approved narrations of individuals from deviant sects. And this is, by the way, Imam Malik did this, Yahya bin Ma'in did this, a lot of the scholars of hadith. Even if someone is from a sect that is deemed to have some deviancy, if they are able to establish that that person is trustworthy, they will take from him. An example of this is Yahya bin Ma'in. One time someone came, he said he's a Shi'i. He says this person will come. A Shi'i person comes to you, to fall from the sky is more beloved to him than lying. So he's very trustworthy. And by the way, I think I made that distinction last time. I will make it again. A Shi'i in their time is not like the Shia of today. Shia in their time is more of a political movement. And a lot of the aqidah differences that developed, they developed after this time. So, just to put that statement into context. This is why it's important to know the person who said the statement, when did they live? And by the way, like deviant sects include the Khawarij as well. The Khawarij, obviously, the Khawarij, like they're called Khawarij because they would kill, like they would consider that whoever commits a major sin should be killed. They considered it kufr. And obviously lying is a major sin. So Khawarij in that sense, they would never lie. Like, if he's true to his madhab, he's not going to lie to you. And you have Khawarij even in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, or narrations from like Imran bin Hittan, for example, the Kharijite. You'll find his narration in Muwatta of Imam Malik. So they're very uh, objective when it comes to evaluating someone's honesty. Shu'bah would even critique his own narrations. He would not narrate a hadith until he heard it countless times. So he would get the guy to repeat the hadith. He was very obsessive. He wanted to make sure he didn't make any mistakes. And he did not narrate much. He only narrated that which he was sure of. So the Shu'bah, despite being this, he was very, very precise. And he mentioned سمعت ابني سعدا فما سعد وما أفلح. Like even his child, he said, like I heard my son Sa'd فما سعد. Like it's kind of like a pun. فما سعد from like happiness. وما فلح. Like he's basically discrediting his own son. And then he was criticized by his own tools. So Imam Ahmad and Yahya bin Ma'in, the friend of Imam Ahmad, the person we're about to talk about, they both compared his narrations to Sufyan al-Thawri. Sufyan al-Thawri, by the way, so Shu'bah died 160, Sufyan al-Thawri died 161. So they're contemporaries. They found Sufyan to be more precise. And this does not discredit Shu'bah. It just means Sufyan is even better when it comes to precision, when it comes to narrating hadith. Like Shu'bah was a very terrifying figure, as you can see. He would humiliate people. In some cases, Abu Awana narrated the hadith and he found Shu'bah's narration to be different. So he changed his narration to match Shu'bah, and it turns out Shu'bah was the one who's wrong. But he's so scared of contradicting Shu'bah. Which is very funny. And then that method of Shu'bah, again, he was passed to his students, and then through his students, they were passed to Ibn Ma'in and Imam Ahmad. So Yahya ibn Ma'in. Now we're in the 3rd century. So we skipped a generation. Basically, I'll tell you the gist of it. Shu'bah, his two most notable students were Abdurrahman bin Mahdi and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan. And they both died in the year 198. So Shu'bah died 160. Ibn Ma'in and Yahya bin, sorry, not Ibn Ma'in. Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan and Abdullah and Abdurrahman bin Mahdi. So Abdurrahman bin Mahdi and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, they died in the year 198. They were the link between Shu'bah and then Yahya bin Ma'in and Imam Ahmad. So they were his two star pupils, and each one of them is known for something. So Abdurrahman bin Mahdi is actually the person who, there's narrations that, why did Ash-Shafi'i write one of the greatest books in the history of Islam, Kitab al-Risala? It was narrated that Abdurrahman bin Mahdi sent him a letter. He said, the Ahl al-Ra'i, like the Hanafis basically of their time, they were running circles around the students of Hadith, or the scholars of Hadith. They're saying, you guys just memorize a Hadith, you don't know what to do with it, basically. So he asked the Shafi'i to write him a book about like understanding or deriving fiqh from the Hadith. So Imam Shafi'i wrote some Kitab al-Risala. And yeah, so Abdurrahman bin Mahdi and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, they were both, again, Hadith critical authorities. Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan was very strict. So they said that if these two agree on someone being trustworthy, then that person is definitely trustworthy. If they disagree, go with Abdurrahman bin Mahdi, because Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan was very strict. Like they didn't be a bit too strict. And then from them, Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan was the teacher of Imam Ahmad and Yahya bin Ma'in. And I mentioned Yahya bin Ma'in because Yahya bin Ma'in was the greatest authority of hadith critique during the time of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim and Imam Ahmad. So he was one of their teachers. Imam al-Bukhari, when he wrote Sahih al-Bukhari, he gave it to Imam Ahmad and to Yahya bin Ma'in to check it for him. To ensure that they're happy with every narration, because Ibn Ma'in was the greatest authority of hadith critique, I guess, or the science of men. And he was the best critic of narrators in their time. That's why I wanted to mention or focus a little bit on him. So by this time, authentic hadith texts are well known. So when we say someone memorized a million hadith, We're not talking about a million statements of the Prophet ﷺ. We're talking about a million chains to the statements of the Prophet ﷺ. But the same hadith can have 100, could be 100 hadith, it's the same statements. It's just narrated through 100 different paths, 100 different chains. So the actual text, the actual statements, those are well known. And there's even a famous narration that, or a famous story, sorry, that someone went to Abu Zur'a al-Razi. Abu Zur'a and Abu Hatim were cousins, and they were among the top hadith. I forgot if which one he went to first, but he went to one of them. Did Ibn Ma'in write or compile? Okay, good question. Sorry, I'll answer that question. Ibn Ma'in, he wrote a lot actually. He wrote hundreds of thousands of chains, but he did not narrate them. He was not focused on the narration. He was more focused on making sure to expose weak narrations, and he was more interested in critiquing. And he left the narration to Imam Ahmad and Bukhari and Muslim. So he doesn't have, as far as I know, Allah knows best. As far as I know, he does not have a hadith compilation himself. He's more like a hadith police. وإياكم. Same, by the way, I'm going to mention two other names who are also very notable. Abu Hatim al-Razi and Abu Zur' al-Razi. These people came a little bit later, so they died about 50 years after Ibn Ma'in, but they served the same purpose in their time period, in their generation, and that was to, again, critique men. So they had such, just to give you an idea of what this means, like all the hadith texts were well known. A man came to one of them, I forgot, I think maybe it was Abu Hatim first. It's one of the two. They're cousins. So he went to one of them and he told him, these hadith, are they authentic? Like which ones of them are authentic? And he didn't even give him he didn't give him a chain. He just gave him the text. Like this is the matan. This is the hadith 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And sorry, Abu Hatim, he's like, this is authentic, this is weak, this is munkar, this is and he's like he graded every single hadith without even looking at the chain. And then he told him, like, how do you know that this hadith is authentic? I didn't even give you the chain. And he says, this is like a knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with, basically. And he compared it to, when you take a piece of gold to a goldsmith, like a ring or whatever, and the goldsmith is able to tell you if it's fake or not, or like to assess the quality. It becomes like a skill or a trade that they acquire, and that's because of how much they were exposed to these different narrations. So at that point, it was more about picking the best chain. When it comes to like knowing if this hadith is authentic or not, that's kind of like a step one. Like they knew this hadith is authentic or not. They're just more interested in the chain being correct or not. And this is why Imam al-Bukhari, this is part of his genius, because he would not just pick an authentic hadith, he would pick the best narration for the authentic hadith, the most trustworthy chain. No authentic hadith in the 3rd century that was not known before. So this actually addresses a very, there's I don't know if it's controversial. It's not really controversial. Maybe it's a common misconception, but a lot of times people go digging into the books that were compiled later after the 6 books of hadith, and they like try to find like these like unique narrations that are not mentioned in any of the major compilations of hadith that we have, like books in the 4th century, like al-Mustadrak by Imam al-Hakim, for example, has by the way, Mustadrak على ما في الصحيحين. Imam al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, he died 405, so he died 149 years after Imam al-Bukhari, and 144 years after 44, yeah, because Imam Bukhari and Muslim died 5 years apart. So about 150 years after Bukhari and Muslim, and his book Al-Mustadrak على ما في الصحيحين, he claims that there are ahadith. So he looks at, okay, he tries to derive the conditions that Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim had for including the hadith in their book. And then he tries to include every hadith that they did not include in their books that matched their requirements. And so he starts including ahadith, but he starts including ahadith that are now deemed very weak. A few of them, some people deemed to be even fabricated. I don't know, for reasons I'll get into. But basically, the idea that I'm trying to get is the books that were written that include ahadith that are not mentioned in these first, I guess, 9 compilations that we have, there's a very low likelihood that they're actually authentic. It's very unlikely that all these imams would miss a hadith, because we said, it's more about the chain. The actual text, the actual hadith matan, the actual hadith content is well known. So to find a narration So for narration, for hadith not to be narrated in any of the five, or sorry, any of the nine books of hadith that were authored in the third century. And by the way, when I say nine major ones, there's also other ones. Yani Ibn Abi Shayba, Ibn Hibban, Ibn Khuzaymah, you had other books of hadith. But like these books of hadith, they really compiled, yani, I want to say like 99%, if not more, of the hadith that are deemed authentic. So sometimes you find a hadith that is not mentioned except in a, like al-Bayhaqi, which is like in the mid 5th century. The likelihood of that hadith being authentic is very low. I just want to say that. Uh, and by the way, I say this, yani, don't feel like you're missing out. Like, I was listening to a sheikh and he was saying, yani, how he doesn't understand why people base their Jum'ah khutbahs or reminders on, yani, hadith that are weak. Like, there's so much authentic hadith that you don't even know what to choose. It's just that due to our lack of knowledge, due to our lack of يعني exposure to the authentic books of hadith. يعني والله, if you open Bukhari and Muslim, like if you ask someone, like how many of us have read Sahih al-Bukhari from beginning to end? I think very few people. In the MSA, maybe one or two people have read the entirety of Sahih al-Bukhari, even once. Um, there's a lot of gems in these books. يعني والله, one of the things that I hope we get out of this is just like we do a khatam of the Quran, we should do a khatam of the books of hadith. طيب, the chains go exponential. I mentioned that many masanid compiled. I mentioned that. There's more focus on hadith directly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. So remember during the time of Imam Malik, the Muwatta would contain statements of the Tabi'een and the companions, because Imam Malik was more concerned about fiqh. Now you have books that were more focused on making sure that we document every single statement of the Prophet ﷺ himself. So there's more focus on the hadith al-marfu'ah, the hadith that are directly connected to the Prophet ﷺ. And the reason is most likely Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i, his usul, about Imam Malik, he would go by the opinion of Ahl al-Madinah, the amal of Ahl al-Madinah, the actions of the people of Medina. Imam al-Shafi'i, he said, yani, he brought back yani, the hadith to the forefront. By the way, Imam Malik, yani, this is in no way, shape, or form a dig at Imam Malik. Imam Malik is an Imam who's universally accepted. It's just a difference in the way that, and the difference in the principles of the usul of fiqh that Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Malik followed. So Imam Malik would put the action of the people of Medina on a higher degree, and his reasoning for that is that, we're only like 2 generations down from the Prophet ﷺ. There's no way that the entire, like the Medini community will be wrong about like an act of worship, for example, because it's like this is where all the companions were basically. Like you're talking 2 generations down from the companions, the most righteous, the best of generations. Imam Shafi'i, he focused a lot on hadith. Yani, like if hadith is authentic, I will use it, even if the people of Medina don't use it or don't act upon it. And this is why, by the way, I don't want to talk a lot about Imam Shafi'i because like we're over time already, and because, yani, mashallah, Ustad Sayyid Hassan, he had a nice, like maybe, I don't know, 15-20 minute section that was unexpected, but a very welcome, I don't know if it's a tangent, but like explanation of why Imam Shafi'i is so amazing. And the Ummah, there's unanimous consensus that the Mujaddid, the reviver of the first century, was Umar bin Abdul Aziz, and the second century, the Mujaddid of that was Imam Shafi'i. There's unanimous consensus upon scholars from all the schools of fiqh. And then after that, obviously, there's difference of opinion on who the Mujaddid. We know the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends in the beginning of every century, man yujaddidu laha amra diniha, like someone who to revive the matter of its religion for it. And some scholars say man yujaddidu could mean one person, could be multiple people. So it just gives you an idea, of why Imam Shafi'i was a mujaddid, and he really changed the way people looked at hadith, even not just fiqh. I mentioned these are some of the critical authorities of hadith. So even the compilers of the book of hadith, obviously they're amazing hadith critics, because they had to do that, because they had to pick. But I just want to focus on Yahya ibn Ma'in. Emergence of people fully dedicated to critiquing narrations and narrators. I think this addresses like your point. So yeah, now in this generation, now you have people specialized in critiquing. So they don't narrate, they just critique. And then you have people who form groups to travel and study. As I mentioned, in this generation, people started traveling a lot because the knowledge became so widespread, sorry. So Yahya bin Ma'in, Ahmad bin Hanbal, Ali bin Madini, Ishaq bin Rahoya, and Ibn Abi Shaybah, these guys would like travel in groups. Abu Zur'a and Abu Hatim, the cousins, they would travel. Bukhari, Muslim intermediate, they would travel together. Imagine traveling with Bukhari, Muslim intermediate. Yani, these three would be like, form groups and go to different cities to learn hadith, to compile hadith. Uh, yeah, طيب. Yahya ibn Ma'in, without further ado, he's born in Baghdad in 158. He met a large number of, so he didn't meet the Tabi'een, he met the third generation. He traveled to Yemen, Hijaz, Egypt, Sham. Yemen, obviously, the famous trip with Imam Ahmed, where they met with Abd al-Razzaq al-San'ani, and they took his hadith from him. Kufa, Basra. Ali ibn al-Madini said, and we don't know of a person from the time of Adam who wrote down more hadith than Yahya ibn Ma'in. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, you asked if he wrote hadith, he wrote a lot of hadith. And Ibn Ma'in said, if you didn't write hadith 50 times, we wouldn't know it. So he'd not only write a lot of hadith, he would write them multiple times. He'd even write fabricated hadith. Yani, there's a narration, Imam Ahmad, he saw him, like he was writing stuff, and whenever someone comes, he kind of like hides the book and he starts writing. He's like, what are you writing? And he said, I'm writing the book, Sahif of Aban an Anas, and Aban bin Abi Ayyash, the person who said yani, Shu'bah would warn people from. So he was writing a hadith narrated from him, he narrates from Anas, or claims to have narrated from Anas. And then Imam Ahmad's like, why? Like, this guy, we don't take hadith from him. And he said, so this way I know if someone brings me hadith and says this is from someone else, I know they've made a mistake. So even a hadith that are fabricated, he would write them down. So if he hears them, he'll know they're fabricated. Uh, Al-Bukhari, I think Bukhari himself, he said, I know 100,000 authentic hadith, and I know 200,000 fabricated hadith. So they memorize the fabricated hadith so they can tell people that they're fabricated. Imam Ahmed says, here lies a man whom Allah created for this matter to expose the lies of the liars. And Ahmed bin Hanbal said, hadith that Ibn Ma'in does not know is not a hadith. If Ibn Ma'in doesn't know a hadith, is not a hadith. By the way, Imam al-Dhahabi said the same statement about Ibn Taymiyyah. He said, الحديث الذي لا يعرفه ابن تيمية فليس بحديث. If Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't know hadith, it's not a hadith. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but it just shows this person is like how knowledgeable and familiar they were with the narrations. And Ibn Rajab, he said, he's the absolute imam of Jarh and Ta'dil is Yahya ibn Ma'in. He was a Hanafi. Imagine, he was the best friend of Imam Ahmad, he was a Hanafi. He inherited the, that's actually funny. Zaid, Assalamu alaikum. You just joined. I literally just said, get the context. But Yahya ibn Ma'in, he's the best, Imam Ahmad's best friend and closest companion, and he was a Hanafi. He inherited Shu'bah's critical methodology and applied it on a larger scale. He was not content with just finding the mistakes, but he also wanted to know where the mistake was made. So if there's a mistake in a chain, he'd go back at every person in that chain, and he would try to find which person from that chain made that mistake, because the mistake would carry over naturally. Like, so that's Yahya ibn Ma'in. And by the way, Yahya ibn Ma'in is a model. Like, you have other people in his time doing the same thing, but he was the most notable one. Like Imam al-Bukhari, the reason why I mentioned all these details about the people before him is Imam al-Bukhari, he inherited all of this information. He inherited this whole process. And Imam al-Bukhari is a prodigy. And Imam al-Bukhari, he was born. By the way, does anyone know Imam al-Bukhari's name? What is Imam al-Bukhari's name? Al-Bukhari is his title. Muhammad bin Ismail bin Ibrahim ibn al-Mughira bin Bardizbah. And he's obviously from Bukhara. So he's, I guess, you would call Uzbek if he were to be born. If he was born in this age and day and age, you'd be labeled as an Uzbek. Yeah, they have difference of opinion. Is he originally Arab? Is he Turkish? Is he Uzbek? Allah knows best. Yani, most likely he's not Arab. But yeah, he grew up in Bukhara. And he's a prodigy. By the age of 11, there's a famous story of his teacher narrating a hadith, and he said, I forgot the names, but he said, and this person narrates from this person. Bukhari said this person did not narrate from this person. Go check your source. He was 11 years old. And the teacher, he went and checked his source, and surely enough, Imam Bukhari was right. He was like, yes, I made a mistake. Imagine, this was back when he was 11 years old. And then I think when he was 16, they went and did Hajj with his family. And then when they reached Mecca, they finished Hajj, he told his family, "Khalas, I'm going to stay here." So his family left, and he basically dedicated the rest of his life into traveling and seeking knowledge and compiling hadith. And by the age of 18, he wrote a book. He called it At-Tarikh al-Kabir. التاريخ, like history, الكبير, big, like the big history, but it's not a book of history. التاريخ الكبير, similar with like تاريخ Baghdad. Like تاريخ Baghdad, you hear the name, you think it's like history of Baghdad. It's not really history. It's basically a book compiling the scholars in the city of Baghdad. تاريخ دمشق, same thing for Damascus. You have one for Halab. So التاريخ الكبير, it's a book that in which Imam al-Bukhari compiles the different narrators of hadith and he grades their strength. He wrote that hadith. He wrote that book. Oh, actually, I have it here. He wrote it at the age of 18. He put almost 13. I wasn't reading the slide. Yeah, so it's the first of its kind, nearly 13,000 people, and it served as his database when he authored the Sahih. So Al-Bukhari compiled about 600,000 narrations from over 1,000 people, shuyukh. And he said, I compiled my Sahih in 16 years out of 600,000 narrations, and I made it hujjah between me and Allah. And he prayed, he showered and he prayed istikhara between each hadith. By the way, there's a very famous misconception. I don't know if you guys have heard it, but people try to do the math. It's like, oh, Bukhari like had 600,000 hadith, and like he compiled over 16 years, and like it took him this many. And they do the compilation. It's like, oh, so he must have like he had like 15 minutes per hadith, which is very funny because it's like in one maybe in a 1 hour gathering he would hear like I don't know 100 hadith. Like that's how it works. And because he had that database in his head, he's very quick to filter. And maybe some of you know the famous story when he went to Baghdad and they tried to, I guess, humiliate him or trip him up in front of the Khalifa. So you had like 10 scholars of hadith in Baghdad. Each one would give him 10 narrations. So you have 100 narrations total. And each one, like they would give him the wrong chain. So the actual hadith would be correct, but they would give him the chain for another hadith. And then they would ask him, do you know this hadith? Do you know this hadith? And he's like, I don't know this hadith. Like he basically said, I don't know to all the 100 hadith. And then he told them, I don't know that hadith that you mentioned, but I know that this hadith, and then he basically matched every hadith that he claimed he didn't know with the proper chain. So he had that database in his head. And it's not like he had to study, like we see a hadith and we have to Google like every single person in the chain and like what was it? Like he had all the information stored in his head before he even started compiling the Sahih. And actually there's stories of the story of why or the motivation behind compiling the Sahih, and there's two narrations. Maybe both of them happened, but like there's two narrations. The first one, his teacher Ishaq bin Rahoya or Ishaq bin Rahawayh. There's a difference of opinion in how it's spelled. The scholars of grammar, by the way, they say Rahawayh. Same with Sibawayh. And the scholars of hadith, they say Rahoya or Siboya. So usually you hear Rahoya because he's a scholar of hadith, and then Sibawayh, you hear Sibawayh, the scholar of grammar. So the grammarians, they take their opinion with Sibawayh, and the muhaddithin, they take their opinion with Rahoya. And I think, like way, I think it's like, when you say wara in Indian or chi in Turkish, it's like a trade, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, so his teacher, Ishaq bin Rahoya, by the way, if we're talking about people who had the fiqhi madhabs, Ishaq bin Rahoya was the faqih of Khurasan. So he's the faqih of Persia, he had a madhab. So Ishaq bin Rahoya, he said to his students, maybe someone should really compile a book on the authentic hadith and the authentic narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. And Bukhari was in that gathering. It kind of like, maybe it triggered something in him. And he probably had the idea from before, but it triggered something in him. It motivated him to go through with this and pursue this project. And in another narration, it was mentioned that he had dreamt of the Prophet ﷺ. So he saw the Prophet in his dream, and he saw that he had a fan, and he was basically swatting away flies from the Prophet ﷺ. And when he was looking at, I don't know if squat is the correct term, like he was, like I don't know what that term is. Like he was basically getting rid of flies, basically, in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So he looked for the explanation, I guess, for that dream, and they told him that you're going to be swatting away flies and basically you're going to be swatting away, I guess, liars from the Prophet ﷺ. We're going to be exposing or cleaning up the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ from lies. So again, he took that as added motivation, and he decided to pursue his project. Imam al-Bukhari, interestingly enough, his book has no introduction. It starts with the first hadith and just goes. There's no introduction, very, very, very few comments, which is the opposite of Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim has a very detailed introduction, talking about his methodology, about his Sahih, Same with Abu Dawud. He has the Risalat Abu Dawud لأهل Mecca. Like most of the scholars, they would give an introduction, and in that introduction, they would explain their methodology and the motivation behind their compilation. Imam Bukhari did none of that. What he did instead is he had his ahadith compiled, and he would have like very detailed titles for the chapters where he would put the ahadith. And these chapters, they were so detailed that uh, people would derive, I guess, the methodology of Bukhari through the chains that he selected, through the names of the abwab. And sometimes you see him writing the name of the chapter and then including a hadith. And sometimes the hadith, the relationship to that chapter name is not directly apparent. So you try to think like, okay, why did Bukhari put this hadith here? And through that sometimes his opinions regarding certain fiqh matters start to manifest. So he's a faqih, not just a scholar of hadith. And some of the hadith, actually a lot of hadith in his book, he would narrate multiple times with different chains each time. And sometimes he would shorten them. Sometimes he would put the whole hadith. Again, it depends on where he's putting the hadith. So there's a lot of research that was done on Sahih al-Bukhari trying to dissect it and extrapolate a lot of his methodology and the reasoning behind the choices that he made when it comes to the chains, when it comes to the specific narrations that he made. And the actual name of Sahih al-Bukhari, the book, is called Al-Jami'. Al-Jami', like it's a compilation. Al-Sahih, it's authentic. Al-Musnad, it's directly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-Mukhtasar, Al-Mukhtasar, abridged. So it doesn't contain every single authentic hadith. It is abridged. It contains the hadith that are, I guess, most important in their respective chapters. Imam Bukhari did not want to include every single authentic hadith. He wanted to shorten it a bit to make it easier, I guess, for people to study or memorize. الجامع الصحيح الجامع المسند الصحيح المختصر. I feel I might have flipped مسند وصحيح. الجامع المسند الصحيح المختصر من أمور رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وسننه وأيامه. That was the title of the book. So he included 7,500, roughly 7,500 narrations. About 2,600 of them were unique, and then you would also have repetitions. Like إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Indeed, actions are judged by their intentions. He put that hadith in his book, I believe, 6 times. It's either 6 or 7 times in different chapters, each time with a different chain of narration. And it's very to give you an idea of how deep the process is. Like the first hadith in Bukhari, إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. Like indeed, actions are judged by their intentions, and every person shall get what they intended. So whoever's hijrah was for a woman, dunya, because for the dunya or for a woman to marry, then their hijrah is for whatever they emigrated to. Hijrah is immigration. So he skipped من كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله. Whoever's immigration is towards Allah and His Messenger, then his immigration too is to Allah and His Messenger. Like that's the famous narration that we know. So he skipped it. And people question, why did he skip it? Ibn Hajar comments, it could be that Imam Bukhari did not want it to seem like he's telling people that I have made this, like I have compiled this book for the sake of Allah. So he's kind of being humble, and he's skipping the first part, and he's just warning himself and I guess everyone else that be careful and make sure that you don't do anything not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you look at the chain of narration, he chose Al-Humaydi, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, عن سفيان بن عيينة, عن يحيى بن سعيد الأنصاري, عن محمد بن إبراهيم التيمي, عن علقمة بن وقاص الليثي, عن عمر الخطاب. So the first 4 names, they're constant. Like the hadith always comes in these 4 names, but the 2 names he picked after, he picked Qurayshis. He picked people from Mecca, from Quraysh. And the people said, because it's the first hadith, maybe he's going, or perhaps he's going by the hadith of the Prophet said, put قدموا قريشا, put Quraysh fourth. So he started with a Qurayshi chain of narrations, because the Prophet said, put Quraysh fourth. So this is the kind of analysis that the scholars did to Sahih al-Bukhari. So that's why some of this, when we talk about the methodology, there's debate. Some of the methodologies contested. Like people's like, oh, Bukhari, he stipulated luqya, for example. He stipulated that there must be a proof that each narrator met their sheikh. Some people argue with this, but basically there's a big difference of opinion. Like that, this is the biggest difference between Bukhari and Muslim. Bukhari, the scholars say that he required that there some sort of documented proof that every person he narrates from has met the person that they narrate from. So in each, he stipulates that everyone, and there must be a documented, I guess, meeting between the two. Imam Muslim, he doesn't stipulate this. Imam Muslim says it is sufficient for him to know that every single person is trustworthy and honest, and that it is physically possible. Like each two people, they lived in the same era. There's enough overlap for it to be feasible for them to have met. So it doesn't require like sort of documented meeting between the two. Like this is the biggest difference. There is a few other differences, but this is why Sahih al-Bukhari, and one of the reasons why he's more strict than Imam Muslim. And this is something that Ibn Hibban, who also wrote a Sahih, he criticized Bukhari for this. But it's not really a criticism, it's just a difference in the methodology. And some people, by the way, they even refuse this distinction between Bukhari and Muslim, but I'm just going by the mainstream view. He required the highest degree of precision in narration. So he would, and several big narrators he didn't use. I'm not going to get into that. There's no, just for the sake of time. He had an eye for ilal, like hidden defects in hadith, and didn't include many hadith because of it. This is why a lot of the hadith we mentioned, al-Hakim, al-Naysaburi, he claims that this hadith should have made it into Bukhari and Muslim because it abides or adheres to their condition. But really, he most likely he missed a hidden defect that Imam Bukhari recognized and chose not to include the hadith because of that defect. I wanted to say something else. Is it in this next slide? Actually, this is good. Yeah. He picked only the most authentic narrations, and from them he selected the best possible chains, in his opinion, in most cases. I say in his opinion in most cases because there are a few cases where Imam al-Bukhari, he actually narrates from someone who is weak. He narrates from someone who's weak. And you say, well, doesn't this go against the definition that they teach us about authentic hadith? They say the authentic hadith, ما رواه العدل الضابط عن مثله إلى منتهاه من غير شذوذ ولا علة. Like a hadith that is authentic, the first two words in the definition or the condition, like العدل الضابط, someone who's trustworthy, so he's someone who's honest and someone who doesn't make mistakes, or like trustworthy in the sense that they don't make mistakes. So how can Bukhari narrate from someone who makes mistakes, who is documented to make mistakes? And the answer to that is, we don't know exactly why he chose this specific person. Like for a famous example is the nephew of Imam Malik. His name escapes me. I forgot, but he narrates. It's going to come to me after. It's going to be a big facepalm moment. But the nephew of Imam Malik, al-Bukhari narrates from him, and Muslim also narrates from him a few ahadith, not every single hadith. He narrates a few ahadith. And some of the scholars, the critics of men, they say that if he was not in the two, if he was not in the Sahihain, if he was not in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim, then I would not have accepted his narration in anything. But Bukhari and Muslim, they accepted a few of his narrations. And the answer as to why they would accept that, or why that is okay, is because there is not a single narration in Sahih al-Bukhari that is not found in any other book, except for maybe one hadith. There's one hadith that's, I was reading a book, I guess, on the methodology of Imam al-Bukhari, and the author is a professor in Turkey. He's like, there's one hadith that he could only find in Sahih al-Bukhari. There's no other chain for it found in any other books. Every single hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, other than that one hadith, there are other narrations, other chains of narration for that hadith, and it's mentioned in other books. And this kind of addresses the question of, what if Imam Bukhari didn't exist? Would we lose any of the hadith? And the answer is no, we wouldn't. Maybe we'd lose one hadith. So even the hadith that were narrated by weak, they had someone who's weak in the chain, there are authentic chains other than the chain that Bukhari chose for those hadith. And sometimes Imam Bukhari would use both, the chain with the weak narrator and the chain with the strong narrator, because we said he would repeat. So a common mistake that Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi would make is he would say, okay, Bukhari, he narrates from this person. So Imam al-Bukhari is okay with this person's hadith. So he'd start narrating every single hadith that person narrates. And it's like, no, Imam Bukhari chose specific narrations that this weak narrator narrated that matches every other strong narrator. And what was I going to try to say? Yeah, he chose very specific ones. Chose very few ones, very few narrations from these people. He's not okay with every single narration that they make. It just kind of shows why sometimes like even definitions may not be 100% 100% accurate. Yeah, it's like kind of like someone, you write a test and one guy gets a 60%, the other one gets 100%. So in the 60% that person A is correct about, their answers to those questions might be better than the one who got 100% their answers to the specific questions that they got right. So and just because the scholars of hadith, even if someone is a bit weak, doesn't mean that they completely disregard them. They might take their narrations in some cases. Is that clear? I feel like I'm not giving people an opportunity to ask any questions.
No, that's clear. That's clear, man.
Okay.
Jazakallah khair.
Also, it is possible that Imam Bukhari, remember we said he's a scholar of Jarh and Ta'dil, like he's a scholar in the science of men. So maybe the person that people after him deemed to be weak, maybe he thought he's not weak. Like to him, he's not weak. And the same thing applies to Imam Malik. Imam Malik, he said, if I narrate from someone, then I trust him. Maybe someone after Imam Malik comes and he says, no, this person is not trustworthy. Like there's an example of one of the narrators in Muwatta of Imam Malik. He's from Basra. Imam Malik, he did not interact with him much, but when he did, he saw enough of him that he thought that this person is trustworthy. However, people from Basra, like people from his city, they deemed him to be weak. So so sometimes the difference of opinion has to do with yeah, sometimes that person's weakness, I guess, is relative, or subjective. Almost done. Critiques of the Sahih. Yeah, he did not narrate a single. Oh, yes. This kind of again speaks about or I guess refutes the argument that some people make that the hadith or have political influences. If you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, Imam al-Bukhari lived in the time of the Abbasids. However, he did not narrate a single hadith on the virtues of Banu al-Abbas or al-Abbas himself, as he found those hadith to be weak. Even though other scholars, Imam Ahmed, for example, they narrate those hadith. They have these hadith in their books. But he did include a lot of narrations about Ali, Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein, Fatima, and he titled the chapters like it's funny because he said Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. It's the same way the Shia refer to her. So he has a hadith on Ali bin Abi Talib and his household, even though there's a great hostility between the household of Ali and the household of like Banu al-Abbas, the Khalifas at the time. So it just shows you that really, even though he would narrate a hadith that would, I guess, not help the government, but actually work against them. Other critiques. He presented his book after he finished it to three of his shuyukh, Ahmad bin Hanbal, Yahya bin Ma'in, and Ali bin Madini. They accepted all of them except for four, and then the scholars later went back and looked at the hadith and they sided with Bukhari, not because they love him so much. He went through, they're very objective, and through their objective process, they sided with Imam al-Bukhari. Remember we said Ibn Ma'in Aslan is very strict. He was critiqued by many scholars. Ibn Hibban, he mentioned that he was too strict. Ad-Daraqutni, he has two books, Al-Izanat and Al-Tatabbu'. In these books, he proof checked, I guess, every single hadith in Bukhari and Muslim. Ad-Daraqutni, by the way, is a huge scholar in hadith. He died in 385. He has a famous statement. He said, "Ya Ahl al-Iraq, i'lamu annakum lan takdhibu ala Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa ana hayy." Like, "O people of Iraq, know that you will never be able to lie about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam as I live and breathe." And he actually had, I think, roughly 100 or 120 critiques, not criticisms, critiques of Sahih al-Bukhari. And actually all of these critiques, none of them had to do with the matan of the hadith, with the text of the hadith. They're all with the chain. It's like, oh, maybe you chose this chain, maybe this chain would have been better. Maybe that chain would have been better. Like he would question Imam al-Bukhari's choices when it comes to the chains that he used, for example, or some of the abridgments that we make. Because remember how sometimes he would shorten a hadith. So it's mostly technical differences. It's not different. He did not say, he did not think a single hadith was weak or fabricated. There's mostly technical differences. And then Imam Ibn Hajar and other scholars, they actually went back and they compared, or I guess they compared the narration that Bukhari chose and the narration that Darqutni, for example, said maybe you should have used that one. And in most cases, it's either that Bukhari actually used both. because he would repeat, and sometimes most of them actually, Ibn Hajar and other scholars, they actually side with Bukhari. And by the way, Daraqutni is not the only person who critiqued or proof checked Imam Bukhari's book. It was done by many scholars, but he is the most notable one. And like honestly, if it passes him, then it passes everyone. He's the strictest. That's why people use him as an example. He criticized just over 100 ahadith, still less than 100%. Less than 1% of the total. He rebutted most of them. Ibn Hajar, I think I mentioned all of this. I don't know why I left this question mark. And Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, this is in Minhaj al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya في نقد كلام الشيعة القدرية. So it's a refutation on Ibn al-Mutahhir al-Filli, who was a Shi'i scholar at the time. He said, such ignorant people think that hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim were taken from Bukhari and Muslim themselves, and that Bukhari and Muslim were prone to error and or intentionally lied. They do not know that saying narrated by Bukhari and Muslim is a sign for us of its authenticity, not that it was authentic simply because Bukhari and Muslim narrated it. Rather, the hadith of Bukhari and Muslim were narrated by countless other scholars and hadith masters whose number only Allah knows. Neither of them was unique in narrating a hadith. There is no hadith that was not narrated before their time, during their time, and after their time by many groups. Even if Bukhari and Muslim had not been created, nothing would have been lost from the religion. Those hadith existed with chains of narrators that achieved the intended purpose and even surpassed it. I think this pretty much sums up the point that we're trying to get across.